further ado, we are going to introduce our speaker for today's session, transgender survivors of sexual violence. So Jessica Rubinsky currently serves as the Assistant Director of Sexual Violence Prevention and Education at the University of Texas in the Wellness Department. Jessica oversees the direction and assessment of university-wide sexual violence prevention and education, having worked in the field for the past 6 years. In addition to working in higher ed and nonprofits, Jessica has worked as a consultant to individuals, communities, and companies across North America. Welcome, Jessica. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. And just clarification, I work at the University of Houston in Texas. I'm sure I wrote it wrong. I'm going to share my screen. Present. Awesome. Okay, so this is me, trans survivors of sexual violence. And so today, just so you kind of know how this is gonna go, we're gonna have like a brief welcome. We're gonna just make sure everyone is on the same page and have a gender 101. We're gonna talk about trans survivors, power dynamics, transformative justice, and then resources. Also want to note that this is a starting point about trans people and trans survivors of sexual violence. As any other group, this isn't a monolith that everyone in the LGBTQIA community has different issues. And so this is just a good place to start, but it shouldn't be the end of your learning or knowledge. I want to give everyone this resource. I will be checking it throughout, and as well as I encourage people to put information on there instead of in the chat. It is called Jamboard. So if you type in your browser, tinyurl.com/svjam, it will have a place for you to introduce yourself and kind of go along with the presentation. And so you can select Post-it notes and put those on there. You can add images, you can add different shapes. And so I'd love for you to interact throughout the presentation through the Jamboard. And it is also in the chat as well. And so right before we get started, I kind of want you can write this down or reflect just to get started. I want you to think of 2 things that are weighing on you kind of heavy today, 2 things that you need to heal, and 2 things that you need to release. This was created by Alexander L. And this way we can kind of think about what we need and what we're struggling with and then put it to the side for this presentation. So I'm going to give you a minute or 2 to just reflect on what you're feeling right now. Okay, so we're going to move on, but feel free to keep brainstorming or writing whatever you need. So if you want, I have a slide that on the Jamboard that says who I am, just in different identities. I really like Shrek. And on the second page, I have like my name, where I live, an organization I work with, and then a fun fact. And I see someone else already put a little Post-it note, Kelsey, in Kansas City, violence prevention and cat enthusiast. I love cats. So if you want to add your own Post-it note, we can see who is in this space. And I like the Jamboard because it's anonymous. So when we have questions later on, you can do so anonymously. So thinking about gender 101, we're going to define some things. So sex is a classification system that is based on a person's biology. So when someone is born, a doctor looks at their genitals and they see if they look like a male or a female. And then they are categorized in that. Some of the time people have ambiguous genitalia or chromosomes that are not XX or XY, and those people would fall into the category of intersex. And intersex is about as common as a natural redhead. And so a lot of time when we think of sex, we think of the ideal man or ideal female, but even when we're looking at biological sex itself, it exists on a spectrum. Let me look at gender. And so gender is really different per person. If you can see the image on the right, it's just different people's definition of what gender means to them. But it's a classification system based on these social ideas of femininity and masculinity. And so I know many of you have done the man and woman box. And so when we think of gender, we typically think of two different genders, female and male. And then we also have gender roles and social scripts that are how these men and women should behave. And so men should be independent, aggressive, the breadwinner, tough, don't cry. Women are more emotional, talkative, nurturing. And so as part of my violence prevention work, I think it's really important to be noticing our different gender roles and kind of dismantling them. With that being said, on the fourth slide, I wanted to give a space for people to give examples of times that they've seen harmful gendered either content or experiences related to the sexual violence work, because that impacts trans folks as well. And so I've put an example of language focusing on women leaves out men and non-binary survivors. And so if you can think of any harmful instances where things are gendered or played in gender roles that could harm the community. Awesome. I see Jenny and Madison and Anna and Vanessa. Thank y'all so much for sharing. So trans 101. So transgender is an adjective. So you would say like a transgender person or a transgender woman. I tend to say trans instead of transgender because I use the word a lot, but it shouldn't be used as a noun or for majority of the time. So something like transgendered would not be correct. It would be like a trans person. And so just defining what trans means, it is someone whose gender identity is not the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. And cisgender is someone whose gender identity is the same that they were assigned at birth. So remember back to sex, biological sex is what the doctor sees in between your legs when you're born and then is written on your birth certificate. So if it's the same gender that you identify as now, you will identify as a cisgender person. I think it's also important to put faces to names. And so here is a beautiful slide of some lovely trans women in the media or celebs. And so a trans woman is someone who was assigned male at birth and is a woman. Words like preferred and also words that are F to M or MTF are outdated. Also, when we're thinking about, we'll get to more of that in a second. Trans men are someone who is assigned female at birth and are a man. These are, again, more celebrities. And then we have a slide showing non-binary individuals. Not all non-binary people identify as trans. Some do. Transgender is more of an umbrella, and non-binary is also an umbrella. And so sometimes people do not feel that their non-binary experience fits under that transgender umbrella. And so trans are people who do not exclusively identify as a man or a woman. And there are people who identify as a non-binary man or a non-binary woman or non-binary sometimes and a woman other times. And that fluidity is totally valid as well. I also want to point out that non-binary people are not confused about their gender or following a new fad that non-binary identities have been recognized for millennia across different cultures and societies around the world. So sometimes people think the word trans stands for transition, but that is not the case. But a transition is any step or steps that someone takes to affirm their gender identity. I personally believe that someone does not have to transition in any way to identify as trans, but there are different ways that people can transition. Typically, people think of surgery, but there's actually multiple different ways. They might change their name, they might use different pronouns, they might start hormone replacement therapy. And then when we're also talking about surgery, people often are like, have you had the surgery? But typically there is more than one surgery that can happen. There's lots of different surgeries in lots of different places, and asking about someone's genitals can often be invasive, but it happens a lot. And so kind of, unless you're really close to someone and they share with you their transition, it's usually not best practice to ask someone about their physical or emotional transition. And let's check out the Jamboard. So I have some examples of harmful gender instances, gender dress codes in schools and workplaces, SANE exams that are not trauma-informed for trans survivors / queer survivors. The questions are already invasive. And if the nurse is not trained or uses presumptions, the language can be really harmful. Yeah. And I feel that SANE exams are already a really vulnerable place. And so it can be hard to have to go through this emotionally long process and then also be experiencing lots of microaggressions. And then lastly, we have when people assume that straightness based on cis femme presenting folk. Yeah. So not all queer people are looking at you and can assume your gender or sexuality. And I do see this a lot too with people using they, them pronouns. They typically will use they, them pronouns with people they feel look trans. And so my rule of thumb is either ask everyone their pronouns or use they, them for everyone rather than just the people that look trans. And so gender neutral pronouns are also becoming more and more popular. Not all non-binary people use gender neutral pronouns, and not all people that use gender neutral pronouns are non-binary. Pronouns do not tell you someone's gender. And so it's important though to make sure that you are correctly using someone's pronouns. You wouldn't want someone to call you the wrong name over and over and over again. Similarly, you want to make sure that you're getting someone's pronouns right. There are multiple websites you can actually go to practice typing. Something I did was in social work school and during my internship, practicing by putting in gender neutral language in my case notes. And so just practicing it in your daily life is super important. And I just assume more and more folks will begin using gender neutral pronouns. If you'll have any questions, feel free to put it in the third side of the Jamboard or the chat. thank you so much for all of the new people who said they're in this space and for being here for my presentation. And so now we get into the less fun stuff. Just really quickly, when we start talking about sexual violence around trans people, I want to be clear that before we even get to rates of sexual violence, just violence overall. So trans youth have one of the highest rates of attempted suicide. 26% of Black trans women live in extreme poverty, compared with about 15% of the general population. I'm pretty sure that 26% makes less than $10,000 a year. And this comes from the LGBT National Task Force. And the life expectancy of trans women is 35, and it's even shorter for Black and Indigenous trans women. I think this is important to just highlight that there are disparities just overall in existing, in employment, in access to resources. And so then when there are compounding factors like different layers of identity, it can lead to even more violence. And I think it's really important to be understanding what is going on in the trans community, because every year there are trans women that are murdered and other trans people. And so it is important to, one, have awareness, two, support with your money trans organizations, and then also advocate for trans people as well. So getting into the sexual violence, this is a statistic that I have from the National Trans Center for Trans Equality from 2015. It is not a peer-reviewed study and it is not evidence-based, but it was a survey where they called trans people from all over the United States, and 47% of the respondents had said that they had experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And so if we compare that almost 50% to the amount that cis females and cis males report experiencing sexual violence, it's almost double. It is double, if not more. And so I think it's really important that we are having specific services and conversations on how to support trans survivors, because we'll get to a slide in a second, but everyone has different needs. And so we need to be not making people equitable, but we need to have equity in our programming and our movement. So we're going to watch a video of some lived experiences of trans women.
I didn't deserve to be attacked, and I definitely don't deserve to be made to feel like it's my own fault. I felt confused, powerless, and helpless. It was a little traumatizing. I was 9 at the time. I had never understood how people were supposed to treat my body. While I was being violated, I was trying to understand how I was being violated. That was really complicated for me.
Out of nowhere, he was standing over me. He was holding me down, pulling my pants down.
All of a sudden, the conversation switched. He started to kind of move forward toward me and became violent. After just talking to this man, his forearm is in my throat and I'm up against this storefront.
We only feel sorry for certain women. We only believe certain women.
For trans women and for femmes, because we're not seen in the binary, especially trans women, like a mockery of womanhood, people don't believe us, or our claims against sexual violence isn't legitimized.
The Me Too movement, it was a little bit disheartening, the fact that this was a woman's work for 8 years and there wasn't really any recognition of that, or even where it came from. There's like a legacy of, Black feminism that the Me Too movement is a continuation of, specifically Tarana Burke. And she's been really great at mentioning queer and trans people. So to see privileged white women within Hollywood essentially co-opting that and turning it into a different narrative was a little difficult for me to see.
in the Me Too movement, a lot of Black women or Black femmes are angry is because it's like we have to like shout from the top of our lungs, where a cis white woman can write an op-ed or just make a claim and the world burns.
The Me Too movement doesn't do a lot to include trans women, because there are a lot of situations where trans women are not just afraid of going out and reporting like something bad happened to them sexually. You're also afraid of, you know, the way that the cops will treat you when you're trans. I don't know a lot of women who have to deal with that.
There was just such judgment about how did you get in this situation? Why were you sleeping with someone that you'd only just met? Like, I wasn't acting in a way that they deem womanly.
We're usually told that we're being very deceitful by being who we are, and it's destructive, you know? It doesn't make me feel like a person.
It's just victim blaming, and all women go up against that. But when you add the trans level, that's an intersection, and that means that I'm gonna then experience what cis women experience, but then with another layer.
There's cis, able-bodied white women out there who, what they're doing I think is amazing, but there are Black trans women out there who are screaming Me Too from the ground that they've just been beaten up on. Some of them are screaming Me Too from the hospital that delayed, and some of them can't scream because they're dead. Realizing that the ability to campaign, the ability to march in the streets, the ability to scream out loud and tell your story is a privilege. With that privilege, you can tell your story, but you also can uplift stories.
In all of this conversation surrounding abuse and rape and sexual crimes, really, there hasn't really been any mention of the fact that trans women are being killed at a higher rate than ever before. We need to ask ourselves why that's the case and who's killing us and why are people killing us. It's lack of information, lack of understanding.
For lots of trans women, especially if they're women of color, there are lots of more barriers to walking down the street, avoiding street harassment, than just making sure that they're not wearing things that can be sexualized.
I don't feel like trans women are allowed to be sexually empowered without it being a thing. I feel like that's a cis privilege thing, that, you know, a woman can be sexual, she can be gorgeous, she can be attractive, and that just be her. But for a trans woman to do that, it feeds into a whole narrative of us being fetishized.
Having to defend my identity it's tiring, it's exhausting. It's like a never-ending fight. I think I have privilege sometimes with passing. I think people tend to kind of brush it off because they're not reading me as a woman. So they look at me as like, oh, you can handle yourself, or you're strong enough to do that. And I think that's where like the dangerous part is.
I don't think that people are ready to be for the nitty-gritty of like the daily lives of trans women's lives, which include sexual violence at the hands of police officers, which includes murders.
I would love cis allies and straight allies especially to be making sure that the message is inclusive of queer people, of trans people, of everybody that doesn't really fit into the narrative that's going on at the moment.
If everyone realized that all of our battles individually are part of like a collective human experience, the things that trans women of color face are about white women too, and are about white men too, and that if all of us are free, then it's a much better world, and if one of us is left behind, then that means that there's no real justice.
It's difficult to understand what everybody has been through, but it just takes listening. I don't think that anybody knows everything. We get things wrong, and there's no shame in getting things wrong, but it's where you go from there. It's how you listen to your sister. And if you're open to listening to what someone else has been through, then no one can fault you for that.
Great. I absolutely love that video. It made some really great points. Also talking about uplifting voices, and just another note too that historically things have been kind of the same, that people have been working hard in movements behind the scenes, but not necessarily always credited for the advocacy and the work that they do, including especially Black trans women. And so this slide kind of shows that we want to move towards equity. We want to be specifically tailoring our services or whatever we do with survivors to making sure that we aren't just adapting one program for all different oppressed or marginalized identities, and instead designing specific programming and community events and advocacy for the people that need it and coming from that group as well. I just want to list some common barriers that LGBT survivors have when experiencing sexual violence or intimate partner violence. And so there are issues around being isolated, outing, using children, using the small community, leveraging institutional violence, and drug and alcohol usage. Someone could use the fact that someone is not out and threatening them with that to use them in power and control. Can also be using their identities to exploit them or negotiate boundaries or prioritize their self. Often the trans community is really small as well, and so using that small number of affirming spaces to monitor the survivor or gather information. And then just using institutions. So a lot of people have negative views of trans people, especially trans women, and so using those stereotypes to further harm trans folks. Also, another tactic that has been seen is using someone's hormone replacement therapy or not giving them access to gender affirming clothing, which might be a case in intimate partner violence of cis people. Maybe there are people who are not letting people wear clothes that they want, but that layer of making it gender affirming, and especially with the HRT, which is the hormone replacement therapy, it adds another layer to it. And while we are talking about abuse of power, we are going to get into power dynamics. So for me, I think it's really important to think about consent and analyze power dynamics. I found this wonderful triangle of consent from Crystal Bird Farmer, and she is an engineer turned educator who focuses on co-housing Black and polyamorous communities. And so when she talks about consent, she says that first there needs to be an analysis and understanding of different power and agency, and then there needs to be communication about that as well as the direct sex acts that are going to happen. And so if we look at agency, it is the ability to recognize the choices that we have for ourselves. It's also that we can have informed judgment. So I like this because it's not just, okay, I have the agency to be able to say yes or no, but also I'm providing my partner with enough information so that they can make an informed decision. Because if you're not including everything that you're interested in or that is going to happen, that person doesn't have agency to say yes or no. And so when we withhold information, we are taking away a person's ability to have agency. Other times that someone might not have agency is if someone has under the influence of alcohol or drugs, children, teens, sometimes neurodiverse, or people with mental illness. Next, power. And so I think especially when it comes to trans folks and their lived experience, there's a lot of power dynamics that are often untalked about in our movement, but if we think about it, a lot of sexual violence comes from power imbalances. Not all, but I think it's important to recognize that seniority, wealth, social support also can contribute to power imbalances. It might not just be like, oh, this is my boss. It might be someone in the community that has a lot of social leverage. That will also be a power imbalance. And people need to start reflecting on why their partner is saying yes and engaging into sex in what positions of power and privilege they have, and how that will impact if a partner says yes and if they could fear consequences. And so making sure to have power and agency prevents people from being coerced. And so I think especially within this presentation, examining power dynamics is important. And then lastly is communication. And so this guides power and agency to make fully informed consent. And in an ideal world, all of sexual acts would be verbally confirmed by each partner. But in reality, it is more through nonverbal cues. I've also found that it is helpful to do before things get heated. And so verbally asking during dirty talk, like, what do you like? Or recognizing agency is disclosing conversations about STIs. So not disclosing STI status could be part of not making sure your partner has agency. And so making sure you talk about if you're vaccinated for COVID or not, the last time you got tested for STIs or COVID, any current sexual partners, use of birth control, all of those can play into the agency and consent that we are giving. I did want to note as well that there are a good number of trans people, trans women too, but trans people in general that do have to engage in underground economic work. And so when we think of that, it would include sex work, drug sales, and other activities that are currently criminalized. There's also survival sex, and so a lot of people have to, not have to, but because of the way that our society marginalizes and oppresses trans people, they don't have as many opportunities to thrive or have access to wealth. And so one study found that 20% of trans people participated in the underground economy. And so sometimes people are trading sex or drugs for a place to sleep, for food, for goods and services. And that number does increase for Black, Indigenous, and documented folks as well. And I think when we're talking about this, it's really, really important to remember that because of our stigma against trans people and our stigma against underground economic work, and making it illegal in our country, it makes it unsafe for trans people and other people to do this work, and it makes them more likely to experience sexual violence. And so our own beliefs around sex work and drug sales and other criminalized activities impact the lived experiences and the violence that trans people face. Yeah, and they just put in the chat, Redefining Realness by Janet Mock. It is a great book that talks about her experience with sex work as a trans woman. And so I'm gonna read some more harmful gendered instances. It's gonna say, not having a gender neutral name of an agency. Yeah, I know at our university, we have the Women and Gender Resource Center, and they struggle because they want all people of different genders to be able to access them, but that name has not been changed. So that is one barrier. And then we have a question. So why are we using folks when folks already is gender inclusive? Wonderful question. I do not know the answer to that. I think it's just another way of saying it. If anyone has the answer to that question, feel free to put it in the chat. But I honestly am not sure. Cool. And I want to add too, if you want to go to slide 5 of the Jamboard, if you want to start writing some ideas for equity. So one idea I had is making sure that you have a trained advocate that is trans to work with trans survivors at your agency. So if you want to try to think of some more equity ideas, feel free to do so. And the last part of this, we are going to talk about transformative justice. And so I want to highlight that transformative justice has been used in Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities historically, and it's just now getting recognition, mostly by white, cis, straight women. And so we need to remember that where it comes from and also give our money and resources and time to Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities. And so transformative justice is a belief that people who caused harm can change and that we all can play a crucial role in that shift. It can be hard to come with the idea that everyone who caused harm can change, but I personally, and I'm sure other people feel similarly, but not everyone, that there currently is not really justice in the carceral system, and that oftentimes a lot of people, especially Black and Brown folks, experience more harm through the system than justice. I also believe that transformative justice is a way of humanizing people. I think we really dehumanize a lot of people in our country, especially by putting them in jail and other things like that. And so believing that everyone has the ability to do better is a way of helping rehumanize everyone. And some different ways that people can be held accountable is recognizing the harm that they have done, even if it wasn't intentional, acknowledging the harm's impact on the individual and the community, making appropriate restitution to the individual and community, and then developing solid skills for transforming attitudes and behavior to prevent further harm. And then also making contributions towards liberation. There's this great book, I have it at the end in my resources, but it's called Beyond Survival. And so I would highly recommend that book if you're interested in learning more about transformative justice and people who have been actively doing transformative justice work. Another quote that I like is shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people. And that is by Nikita Valero. She tweeted this and it went viral, but the context behind that was she was exhausted and frustrated by the number of responsibilities she had and being told to practice self-care. It had been 9 days after 50 Muslims were murdered, and she felt like she didn't know what to do. She couldn't move, she couldn't help people, and she felt like people, especially non-Muslims, needed to share the challenges that she had as a lived experience as a Muslim woman. And so I think this is super important, along with our work, is recognizing that if we don't change systems, we aren't really helping people, and oftentimes people that need systemic change are being told to take care of themselves, when in reality it's the systems that are failing them. And so I found this quote around that. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of buzz about self-care. And while self-care may be defined differently from person to person, there's a general cultural understanding about what it is. Generally speaking, self-care is an act of individual attending to their needs. However, community care is a term that is rarely used outside of movement spaces yet, and is an essential ingredient needed for collective healing and restoration. Community can be defined many ways, For some of us, our communities are defined by geography, places we live, work, pray, and play, by fellowships and shared values with others, from spiritual practice, those we feel most connected to, and for a lot of us, it's some combination of those. And so, what is it about community care, and why isn't it self-care? Community care is important work of taking care of our community ecosystem, the people and the places that we're in community with. Now more than ever, we need to cultivate a sense of community, and that is super integral to the work that we are all doing to end sexual violence. And so we want to continue to foster a sense of belonging with one another, and helping change systems so that when we are fighting for ending of violence, we're ending violence for all people and not just specific types of people. And it is everyone's duty to not only acknowledge your own privilege, but to take it a step further and leverage your privilege to help and support different communities. So I talked about transformative justice and starting to take responsibility and leveraging power. A lot of times people do not know where to start. And so the best place to start, I think, is to reflect and self-accountability. So we're gonna watch this video on self-accountability so we can start having ideas of where to begin in this transformative justice process.
At its core, self-accountability is looking at yourself, looking at your values and your choices, and seeing, are those the choices that you're making every day, to see if those are aligned with your values. So you're trying to say, you know, do the choices I make today align with who I want to be? And there's always going to be a gap between that, because we're never our perfect visions of ourselves. But that, you know, if there's something that I did that's fundamentally outside of who I want to be and what my values are, self-accountability gives me a tool to be able to look at that and say, like, oh, that's not who I want to be. What do I need to do to clean that up? What do I need to do to take care of that? And each of us building that individual skill is actually how we collectively get to a place where we can create communities where accountability is possible for other people.
That might be a concept that is a bit of a shift for people. When we talk about accountability, we're so used to talking about accountability meaning like, I'm going to go get that person who did something wrong, and accountability is going to happen to them. And I've heard you talk a lot about how that can be kind of a setup. And so I'm just curious about sort of that shift to self-accountability. Why, and you started to talk about it, but why is it self-accountability the focus there, in addition for survivors, but also for anyone?
Yeah, self-accountability is essential in my opinion, because it is so common for people to want to rush to holding other people accountable. People are so much more comfortable to say, how can I hold that person over there accountable? And in my experience, no one wants to also be held accountable by someone who's not doing their own work. And that self-accountability is the building block for accountability on a community level. And people get very interested in the how of self-accountability. And I think this is one of those things that's simple but not easy. There isn't sort of like a magic answer that if you just did this one new thing, it would solve all of the problems. It's much more a set of skills and tools that people are already using. I think it's essential to have some kind of daily practice. And that practice can look like lots of different kinds of things. For me, that's dancing, that's movement, that is hanging out with my friends, hanging out with my dog. Also, one of the things that I do to support myself in the task of being responsible for my choices, in this task of self-accountability, is to look and see, you know, were the things that I said and did today that were outside of my values, and then to be reflecting on, are there things I need to do to clean that up? So that might just be like, hey, I was rude to you yesterday. I was short. I'm sorry. That was not who I want to be. Sometimes there are bigger things, and often when there are bigger things, I find it really essential to get help from my loved ones, from the important people in my life, and particularly someone who's not involved in the situation, because it's really hard to see things when you're inside of them. It's hard to see the answers to something that's really up close to you. So getting support from folks, having a daily practice of kind of reflection of whatever that looks like, I think are some of the core pieces. And frankly, you could probably spend your lifetime just practicing those and get pretty far. Sometimes there's an idea of like, just because you practice it a lot, it should feel easy. And it's not, it's hard. And that the work of it is turning back towards it over and over again. And so it's like, oh, that wasn't exactly what I want to do. Let me try again. And so it's, instead of being perfect, it's just continuing to try to do your best approximation of who you want to be.
Awesome. Also wanted to add, Madison answered the question in the chat. They wrote, my understanding is that it's a way in shorthand and an extra step of an inclusiveness, specifically for LGBTQIA+ people. Since a lot of neutral/inclusive language includes an X, for example, Latinx folks is a way of showing solidarity and inclusion of Latinx, queer/LGBTQIA+ folks. It is a signal for queer inclusion. This is just my understanding though. So if anyone has more or better info, would love to learn more, even as a queer identified person. And similarly to that is lifelong learning and lifelong unlearning. I believe that everyone has more to learn and grow, and that we should always be constantly striving to learn and grow and do better. So if we're thinking about accountability and working on transformative justice, I think it's important to not just start being like, okay, how can I create systems to get transformative justice within the sexual violence movement or for trans survivors? I think it's first doing the internal work. So as we watched in that video, the self-accountability, doing some self-reflection, identification, I highly recommend, I have it on the last slide of the Jamboard and this presentation, a book called How to Be Anti-Racist. It has about 10 or 12 activities and it's a super easy read. That is a good place to start. There's also a margins of center worksheet where you can identify your own and then your organization's different identities that you're serving. And then just remember that everyone will continually to unlearn these isms. So there's no one person that is absolved of homophobia or racism, and we need to continue be checking in with ourselves and with others to make sure that we are working towards being the best person in the movement by checking our own biases. I think it's important to build internal community. And so finding the people that you're already in community with and having conversations around the self-accountability piece. I think also thinking if you're going to do a larger internal community building, you need to be very wary of power dynamics because the privileged identities and the power dynamics might make it so that there never is a way for an entire agency to be doing this work just because of the way power dynamics are. Because if someone is your boss, you're not going to be able to speak your mind because this person could get you fired. And so it's important to recognize that agencies may think about becoming non-hierarchical or other things, and in order to push this idea of equity. I also think that when you're creating these environments that you need to really, really, really look at if every person can actually contribute. Oftentimes we think that, oh, everyone is great and everyone's voice is being heard, but in reality, there's so many barriers and reasons and people aren't being heard or listened to. And so when thinking of that, it's also important to think that in community building, we need to prioritize and have people in leadership that have large amounts of marginalization instead of those in power or who have traditionally been the ones with power. Let's go back to the Jamboard quickly. I saw some great ideas for equity. So someone said hiring trans leaders and agencies. Another person said educating clients and staff who perpetrate homophobia and transphobia, even as a defense mechanism. Yeah. Even explaining the link to homophobia and belief in rigid gender roles and how that relates to sexual violence prevention. Super important. If you want to look at slide 6 on the Jamboard, if you want to give some examples of when an agency has, what is an example of someone who has agency and what is an example of someone who doesn't have agency, and then different power dynamics that we might not typically think about, and some different unique ways to communicate. I would love to see what y'all come up with for that. And then if you have any other questions, feel free to put that on slide 7. And let's see. Yeah, I think I finished a little early, but I guess we can open up for questions. If you go to slide 9 of the Jamboard, I also have these as well, but I have some great resources for you. Beyond Survival is the book that I mentioned that is a collection of essays around transformative justice. The Trans Lifeline is a non-response suicide hotline. And so essentially, if someone is suicidal, they will not call the police on them. And so that is a way of agency of if you decide you want to make this decision, that is how this goes. There's also the Northwest Network out of Seattle. It is an LGBT founded violence prevention org that does a lot of work in the community. This book is anti-racist, I mentioned earlier. Love is Respect is a great website. You can safety plan, you can learn about dating. And then I have a Margins of Center worksheet that I mentioned as well, also in the Jamboard and in the chat. And then lastly, shameless self-plug, I Believe You LLC. I started doing prevention work in college because I realized that high schools were not talking about sexual violence. And so I started just for free and in my free time, just going to different high schools and having conversations around sexual violence. And then now I have a business where I do consulting on the side, of course, but I just really think that I can see a world without violence. And so I think it's important to advocate and yeah, I'd love to answer any questions. Feel free, I know there's a lot of people, but if you want to raise your hand and then be unmuted, you can also do that as well, because I went kind of fast.
Jessica, I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. I personally learned so much, and I just appreciate all the resources. Look at all these wonderful resources that you're sharing with us. Also, shout out to Emiliano, who is dropping all the phenomenal resources in the chat throughout the presentation. But just thank you so much for sharing your expertise, knowledge, and everything with us.
Totally. Thank you for having me, and I hope that everyone found at least one resource that will be useful to them. I think as a social worker, I'm always like, I need all of the resources. Someone put under power dynamics, student and faculty / staff dynamics. Yes. Someone for an idea for equity put prioritizing health insurance companies / plans that cover gender affirming healthcare. Totally. I've also, I haven't seen it in practice, but advocating for specific time off for maybe trans people getting gender affirming surgeries and stuff like that. So making sure that in addition to it being covered by healthcare, which is super, super important and is not, I believe, in most, especially here in Texas, but people have the time off to be able to go get those gender affirming surgeries then.
So I see we have a question in the chat. It says, can you talk a little more about the use of the word femme?
Yeah, I personally try to not use the word femme. I feel that sometimes we accidentally recreate the gender binary in efforts that we make. And so sometimes people will say women and femmes, but it's like, to me, what are you meaning by femmes? And I think it's often female presenting people. And we have this idea that men / masculine people are the only ones perpetrating violence, when in reality, people of all genders perpetrate violence. And so I think the word femme is an attempt to be inclusive, but I think it's best to clearly state who you want in that space. So I've had spaces where I say, okay, this is an LGBTQIA queer space, but no cis men. And for me, the reason behind that was cis men have lots of power and privilege, and cis gay men can go to any bar and they can be welcome. It was a social event. And so I think just clearly stating who the space is for, and being aware that sometimes attempts to be inclusive are actually not inclusive. Was that helpful, Rick? Someone wrote, sometimes it seems femme gets used to womanize non-binary people just because they're not men. Yeah, it's almost as if it's like women light. And it's like, no, I think there's also pressure for some non-binary people to be more masculine or have a level of masculinity and androgyny, but in reality, non-binary people present all over the gender spectrum, and it's okay if they're super feminine looking or super masculine looking, and non-binary people don't owe anyone androgyny, and so I think that's important too, to just kind of, something I started doing was I would hear in my mind, like, okay, is this person a boy or girl? And I just had to start saying, why does it matter? And start questioning those internal thoughts that I had. And so I think that could be a helpful practice of like, why does it matter? It doesn't matter. Like, also, who cares? And so just starting to question those internal beliefs that we don't even notice we have can be really helpful in helping trans and folks along the gender spectrum.
Jessica, may Tasa share this resources page on our social media?
Yeah, totally.
Great, thanks.
Any questions about doing this work in your organization or issues that you've had? More ideas for equity is you making sure your forms are gender inclusive, gender in a space after instead of fixed checks boxes. Yeah, there are people who are agender and people who just are along a different gender spectrum way more than what I went into today. And so giving the space for people to clearly identify how they feel best fits with them is super important. Yeah, changing every he or she or girl or boy on forms, policies, handouts, and stories. Yes. Also, when we think about changing forms and changing content and the pronouns, we also want to make sure that the activities and the stuff itself isn't gendered. So making girls do something separate than boys and it being gendered, or putting, I see this a lot, like, okay, we know that anyone on any gender can be experiencing sexual violence or perpetrating it, but for these purposes today, we're going to talk about male perpetrators and female survivors, and so we're going to use the she and the he language throughout. And to me, that kind of just feels like, okay, we're going to pretend that this is the only type of violence, and even though statistically it may be the higher rates, or not even, I think that actually having conversations about how male survivors struggle because of masculinity and how trans survivors are left out of conversations a lot of the time can really help, rather than just kind of being blind and to the whole situation. Yes. So I have a question. How do you feel about the use of he/she/they in documents or publications, as opposed to using just they? I think that I personally would just use they. Publications are like very professional, and I think too, like if we look at evidence-based or peer-reviewed stuff, it's oftentimes not the most marginalized people, because there's not a big enough population size or data, or it is found to be what people have been saying in their lived experience for a long time. And so I don't necessarily think that professional publications are always able to advocate for those most marginalized. So I personally would use they, because we use it all the time. If you left your phone and I was like, hey, this person left their phone, I don't know who they are, they should come and get it. It's a normal sentence you've probably said in your life, and you're using they pronouns as a singular. So I think just use they. And then someone said, can you elaborate on the life expectancy of trans women being 35? Yeah, so just because of the lack of resources to finances, as well as extreme violence against trans women, most of trans women, 50% die before the age of 35 and 50% after. I would urge you to just Google your city and the trans people who were murdered, even in 2021. I know there was someone in San Antonio and in Houston recently, and there was someone who was literally, trigger warning, murdered, and then their body disassembled and put into a suitcase. And so not only are trans people being murdered, they're being murdered in really violent ways. And the reason that it is 35 is because of the just oppression and discrimination and lack of ability to thrive. So if you think about it, trans people oftentimes lose their family or friends or other people because of their identity, maybe even their job. So their access to finances is cut off, their access to social support, their access to living. And so when we think of the average queer person, they might not have a supportive family or not have a supportive job, but I've seen more and more that in trans folk, it often is almost all of them, not always, but like they have issues at work, they have issues in their social life, they struggle to be accepted in their family. And so I feel like losing that sense of support and community throughout all of it, again, this is a generalization in my opinion, I just think that because of the oppression that they face, that in the violence, trans women can't always just, like, again, that video stated, walk down the street. They will get attacked or called a tranny or other inappropriate words. shouted at them. Hope that was helpful and not too much of a rant. Any other questions? Dying from proper or lack of medical care. Yeah. I watched a movie about a trans man who died from ovarian cancer, and his doctor refused to remove his reproductive organs years before. Yeah. A lot of trans people don't feel comfortable going to the doctor. I know I personally have never recently, since I've come out, had a super positive gender affirming experience. And so when there's a layer of that, there's also a layer of not being taken seriously, over sexualized because of your gender. And oftentimes trans people's concerns aren't taken seriously, let alone access to healthcare if they have health insurance. So yeah. And they have another one that says content warning, murder/serial murder. A Texas-specific example was a series of serial murders of trans women in Dallas a few years ago, and DPD refused to investigate it as a serial hate crime murders. Someone else wrote, was about to ask a question relating to that topic. Is there a lack of quality of care for trans people? Yes, I would say that majority of trans people don't go to the doctor or are afraid to go to the doctor, or there are also specific barriers. So if you just wanted to get a breast augmentation or reduction, you could go and get that. But when trans people want to get gender affirming surgeries, they have to apply one or two, maybe even sometimes 3 letters from a doctor and or therapist. They have to prove that they've been living as this identity for a certain amount of time. And so even when we think about access to like life-saving surgeries, most of the time, it is extra barriers that trans people specifically have to go through. And HRT is really, hormone replacement therapy is really hard to access a lot of times, especially in rural areas. And then I've heard of instances of pharmacies refusing to give out syringes for injecting testosterone. So the pharmacy will just refuse or give the wrong size needle so that people do not have access to some of their hormone replacement therapy. Someone wrote, medical professionals get weird about treating trans folks for routine health issues, as if you don't have allergies, but rather trans allergies, and ask intrusive questions that are not relevant to the health issue they're there for. Yes, during the pandemic, was very sick for 7 months, and no one could figure out what was wrong with me. And I didn't have COVID, but I was tested for, I think, syphilis and chlamydia like 7 times, instead of like actually believing what I was saying was going on with my body and listening to the symptoms that I had. They just continually gave me STI testing. And that is another example of how trans people are just not even getting help with their regular health issues. I also would say clothing can be really hard and expensive. To trying to fit clothing on your body specifically, because it wasn't created for the type of curves or the flatness you have, or it doesn't feel good on your body, to also the violence that people could face shopping in the men's section or the women's section, because oftentimes stores are very gendered. And so it's also the price. A lot of people can't afford gender affirming clothes or gender affirming surgeries, and so they have to go without, which can lead to higher rates of suicide. And some people also don't want to physically transition or have gender affirming clothes, but that often makes them higher rates of people misgendering them because they look like blank gender. And so they just assume based on the way that someone looks what their gender is. And so it's important not to have an idea of what someone's gender is just based on the way they present. Someone's presentation of their gender, so gender presentation is not the same as what their gender is. And it could change from the morning to the night, from day to day, every month. We don't know. Here is a resource that is Gallup Movement, is a directory of licensed mental health practitioners who do free consultations and letter for trans folks seeking gender affirming care. That is amazing. Yeah, because oftentimes if you need that letter, then you have to pay, you have to wait weeks to get in with a mental health professional. Thank you for that. Why are pharmacists allowed to do that? They do not get to say no to providing birth control pills or Plan B ridiculous. I did watch a film that someone was underage, and so the pharmacist told them no to getting Plan B. So I think pharmacists have some sort of weird power, not always, but I think there are some weird things that people just don't feel comfortable. They don't feel comfortable giving out needles, even if it is for gender affirming healthcare. Check out the Trans Latina Coalition. Support the Trans Women of Color Collective. My agency has a male and female clothing and toiletry bags for survivors who seek support. So I try to have as many bag size options available as possible in case a survivor would rather choose from both styles and types of products. Yeah, and I think also like not all women who are cis dress the same way. Some women dress more masculinely. And so when we separate things by male and female, like oftentimes it's for funding or because that's just the way it is. But in reality, I think we can start to try to softly push, but also looking at, okay, am I creating and advocating for more help, or am I going to accidentally lead to more harm by advocating for this? So reflecting. Yeah, and please support and check out TENT. There has been an unprecedented amount of legislation harming trans folks, especially trans youth. And it's just trans people, and I would say a lot of people in this country need more support than previously. So make sure that you are keeping up to date with everything going on. Yes. What are examples of non-carceral resources / systems that an organization can develop for survivors who do not want to work with the carceral system? Love this question. I personally would start with asking survivors what they want and need. So after you're doing that self-accountability place and the internal community building and external community building, starting to have conversations with survivors on what they need and what they want that has nothing to do with the carceral system. And sometimes it'll be, I want that person to apologize. I want all this. And so once you start having that data of what survivors in your community or in your area want and need, then I would begin to then start developing those resources. And if you're specifically interested in that, Beyond Survival has a step-by-step guide kind of to talk you through how you can begin coalitions of transformative justice within your organization. But I would also say this is not something you just want to try willy-nilly, and that you want to make sure that you are having constant conversations, that you're always improving, and that you are centering survivors as well as those survivors that are most marginalized. Yeah. Cool. Any final questions or comments? Thank y'all so much for attending this. I also have a website and I do consulting. So if you want to make your workplace more trans inclusive or have a presentation from me similar to this one, feel free to reach out. Even just being professional resources and connections. I love getting to know other people doing this work. And so please feel free to shoot me an email, and thank you so much for attending.
Again, thank you so much, Jessica, for your knowledge, your expertise, and just sharing all that information with us. Like Laura mentioned, we will be sharing those resources that you shared with us on TASA's social media. Thank you all so much for being here in this space. Maybe Emiliano, if you still have the Spotify pulled up, maybe we can exit to some jams. But thank you all so much for being here. And on your way out, folks, if you can fill out the evaluation, there is a survey for this space. So feel free to fill that out for us. I will repeat that in case some folks had any difficulty hearing, but on your way out, when you exit this Zoom chat, there will be a Survey Monkey that pops up for this specific workshop. So feel free to fill that out. We would love to hear what you thought about this workshop. And Madison dropped it in the chat. Thank you so much, Madison. But thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you all for joining us. We have a few more minutes, so if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. Jessica is still with us, so if you want to stick around and ask a question or comment, feel free to do that. You can also private chat with Jessica, so if you're not comfortable sharing your question or your comment in the public chat, feel free to private message them.
I see one question. It just says, how would you go about changing forms when the database encouraged for the use of limiting gender identities? Someone wrote, can you make any changes, addition to the database, like adding a short answer box so that someone can write in? Yeah, there's always a way around it. It might not be easy and it might not be preferred, but can always advocate and or push for more inclusivity.
Right on, Jessica. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if folks need any assistance in terms of victim services, we encourage you to contact TASA so we can help you think through, provide you with technical assistance or training related to these issues. So again, thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, and for what you shared just from your own personal experiences too. So I really appreciated that. So yeah, thank you everybody who's sticking around. Remember that we have workshops this afternoon, so we hope that you come back and we hope you take a break and get some lunch and join us this afternoon. We'll be starting back up at, I don't know off the top of my head, at 1:30. So we hope that you will join us for the remainder of the day, and for us, of course, for the last day of the conference tomorrow. Still a lot of folks in here hanging out, so say hi, leave a comment, ask a question. Jessica, at one point there were like 70+ people in here. It was wild.
A lot of people. I'm half like, I'm glad I was virtual because I would have been more nervous in person, but also like, I don't know.
You would be fine. We hope that you will consider submitting a proposal for next year's conference, which hopefully, if the universe treats us well, it'll be in Houston next year.
Thank you, Madison. I would love to submit a proposal. I'm like, I would just do the same presentation again, but I probably should.
You could do like just up it. You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of interest, and I think there's definitely a need for folks. I think this was great for, especially for new folks. I think you provided a lot of one-on-one stuff, and I think as well as you got into some really much more critical conversations that so you got to think what's next level. What do folks need next, and I'd love to see that. I'd love to see you present that for us in the future.
I'll have to.
Yeah, there are still 15 people in here. You don't have to leave. You can hang out if you like with us.
Oh.
All right, Jessica, we don't want to take more of your time, but do you have any questions or comments for us? Is there anything that you need as we start wrapping
Well,
this
I
up?
get a copy of the feedback for this session.
Yes.
Awesome.
As well as I think you're registered for the conference, correct? Yeah. So you're attending the conference yourself. You should be able to access the link to the recording. So it will be available, on our YouTube channel as well in the future. So hope you have an opportunity to review it and share it. And it was great.
Thank you all so much for having me, and I'm excited about, I don't know, maybe next year.
Yeah, and if you need anything else, contact Alexis, and if you have any additional questions or you need any additional information. But thank you so much for your time today. It was a fantastic
Awesome.
workshop.
Thank you all so much for supporting me.
All right. See you later.